Greetings, friends. My name is Vasyl Pekhnyo. You are at the News Factory. I invite you to review the battle map as of the morning of June 10th. It's Tuesday. Let's sum up the past day. Today, I will focus on the directions that are causing the most panic among Ukrainians. No matter how much I talk about this from an informational standpoint, I am not saying that it's wrong to cover the situation there. And by that, I mean Sunumi region and Zaporizhzhia. Why is it wrong to focus solely and exclusively on them? Because up to 80% of combat clashes are currently taking place in Donbass, and undoubtedly the main intensity of fighting, as well as the enemy's primary interest in territories, is precisely in Donbass. And to be honest, I'm not even sure that I will start with Donbass, with covering the situation there. So on the deep state map, our main directions consistently remain Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, as well as Lyman and Siversk. By as well as, I mean that the Russians have ambitions for them. That is Donetsk, Pokrovsk more precisely, Donetsk, Kostiantynivka, and Siversk. With the goal of reaching the borders of Donetsk region, Donetsk, in some places the Russians are actually quite close to the borders of Donetsk region, while in other places it's as far away for them as crawling to the sky. Here we can see I am now outlining on the deep state map, an OSIN project we always use, the borders of Donetsk region, which the Russians have as their strategic objective to reach. All of this is what they need to overcome. That is, in some locations, for example, right here, the Russians are already very close and have actually entered the territory of Dnipropetrovsk region. Of course, this will now be spread as a major information narrative about how supposedly the Russians are already in Dnipropetrovsk region. This is information in the style of informational bait from the enemy, because right now the front line is quite uneven. And with all due respect to Deep State, to the Institute for the Study of War, or other Western projects that exist, none of them are simply able in principle to reflect what the current line of contact actually is. It's all quite banal and straightforward here. Why is that? Because airborne drones from both sides, Shafe, essentially turn the gray zone at the front into an area where nothing living and nothing mechanized can move, stretching about 10 to 15 kilometers deep into the rear, on one side and on the other. In other words, it's not the case now that the red line of occupation runs neatly along the places marked, including on open source intelligence projects. Right now, the gray zone is very wide. That's the first point. Secondly, the greenery is currently working in favor of the Russians. Nature has blossomed wildly and turned lushly green. Every bush is covered with green leaves. Every tree, every blade of grass has turned green. And in some cases, the grass has grown quite tall. As a result, all this allows the Russians to advance between our very loosely held defensive lines. Why are they so loosely held? Because once again, there are two explanations for this. First, Ukraine is genuinely experiencing an infantry crisis. We don't have enough infantrymen, and this is a problem we will continue to face. The further we go, the more acute it will become. The second point, right now there isn't even a need for such a large number of infantry. That's the first thing. Secondly, we don't have that kind of war. The war has changed significantly since 2022. If earlier the eyes of the front were the infantrymen sitting at the observation post, not allowing the Russian infantrymen through, now it's not just a single Russian infantryman or a single piece of Russian equipment. Now it's a horde of infantrymen, 100, 200, even 300 people in a single day. So this one infantryman who was watching the battlefield simply cannot physically stand against this horde. Against this horde, Ukraine must deploy equipment, first and foremost, robots, so that they can destroy as many Russians as possible. If the Russians have chosen this necromantic path of behavior in the form of constant, unending attacks with their personnel land, that is exactly what is happening. Our army's task is to eliminate as much of this enemy manpower as possible. Because the main task of the army is not even to hold territory or to preserve settlements, but to destroy the enemy's army. And this is exactly what our soldiers are doing now, trying to prevent them, among other things, from reaching the borders of the Dnipropetrovsk region. Because here, of course, the occupiers would declare a major political victory. They will try to enter the Dnipropetrovsk region, raise their flags here, show off, boast, and play on our nerves through information warfare. Well, in fact, this is a prospect that may even happen in the near future, but what can you do? There's really nowhere to run from here, so to speak. The most important thing to point out, probably, is that the greatest danger that comes with each further advance of the Russians is that these inhumans simply destroy everything in their path, literally everything, And this everything includes, in particular, every settlement they approach. For example, Kostiantynivka, no extra words are needed here. Here is Kostiantynivka. As you can see, it is already starting to be gradually encircled by the enemy from three sides. And of course, enemy shells and enemy drones are now starting to come in from three sides. Next, once again, the following video needs no commentary. This is the work of our state emergency service, which is evacuating a civilian, because it was the civilian car that was hit by the enemy drone. In other words, the risks for the civilian population increased dramatically just by being in such frontline areas. And the Russians are doing everything they can to turn Kostiantynivka, like other frontline cities such as Pokrovsk, into a ghost town, including by targeting civilians. Please direct your attention to the screen.
We wrapped the legs as best we could.
Vasyl. Yes. Roman Senishin. Come on, come on. The leg is broken.
Roman Senishin, they got caught some.
Roman Senishin. Is that all? Roman Senishin. Come on, come on, come on. Roman Senishin. That's it. Yeah. Roman Senishin. Okay, easy. The leg. We laid him down. The leg is broken. Roman Senishin. Yeah, sound the horn. Let's go. Did mine click? Everyone has got people. Let's go. We're heading back. Everyone has already left.
Roman Burenko. So, friends, about the civilians, just like in Kherson, just like in Sunumi region, these are the kinds of risks, the kinds of dangers that exist everywhere the boot of a Russian soldier advances, or whenever they approach any populated area. We actually have a very serious problem with their firepower. When it comes to FPV drones, you can look for some countermeasures, some ways to fight back against them. But when it comes to aviation, that's probably where the biggest problem is, as long as the KABs. Until the issue with the KABs is resolved, we will continue to have a major problem. In other words, the issue of the guided aerial bombs that the Russians are using. This is probably the most important issue we have in the Donetsk region.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Now I will also talk about Donetsk region, but specifically the southern part, and at the same time about Zaporizhzhia, though not about the area with the highest number of combat clashes. So what is important for us and what should be known and understood about Zaporizhzhia? There are certain movements happening here, particularly related to Mariupol, specifically involving the movement of equipment toward Mariupol, equipment that is being moved from Russia, for example, from Crimea, including in one direction towards Zaporizhzhia, in another direction toward Donetsk, and in a third direction toward Taganrog. From there, from Taganrog, this equipment, as it turns out, is being sent to the Sumy region and Kursk. At least this is what sources from the Center for the Study of Occupation are reporting, led by Petro Andriushenko, the former advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, who receives a lot of insider information from the occupied territories and constantly analyzes this intel. So what does Andriushenko report among this insider information? So, number one, last week, military equipment with this new identification mark was observed in Mariupol. What was the purpose of applying this mark, a tactical sign, a tactical marking on the equipment? For now, it's hard to say whether this equipment was intended to carry out more active offensive operations in the Zaporizhzhia direction, or if it was redeployed to the Donetsk direction. Most likely, I assume that it could be the Zaporizhzhia direction, because last week, even on the deep state map, and deep state analysts were reporting that in the area of Malinivka, this is the Huliaipol direction. Here is Malinivka, and here is Huliaipol. So in the area of Malinivka, the Russians carried out a series of attacks in an attempt to probe and make this particular section of the front more active. For what purpose? For the same informational purpose, to put maximum pressure on Ukraine, on Ukrainian society, to exhaust people who, under the fire of drones, under the fire of rockets, under the fire of everything that comes flying from the Russian Federation, are growing weary and will start to demand a quicker capitulation. That is the enemy's goal. In the same way, they are now putting informational pressure on Zaporizhzhia, trying to suggest or make it seem as if an offensive on Zaporizhzhia is about to happen soon, to reinforce this idea and similar things. That's why such equipment was observed in Mariupol. It is quite likely that it was intended to be used in Zaporizhzhia. But as we know, in Zaporizhzhia, recently, and I have mentioned this repeatedly in previous battle map reviews in Zaporizhzhia and in the south in general, Our defense forces have organized an entire sabotage campaign against Russian movements in the frontline areas, particularly involving the use of the railway. Among such events, I'll mention the most recent incidents that have taken place, for example. In particular, of course, this is a kind of point number one is the destruction of 13 tanks and more than 100 units of light armored and automotive vehicles. This is what happened, according to reports from last weekend. In addition, there were sabotage operations on the railway line between Mariupol and Taganrog. In addition, south of Melitopol in Yakimivka. Furthermore, Melitopol itself has experienced multiple power outages. Additionally, there is the Crimean Bridge, and we also have Chonhar. Additionally, in the Tokmak area, fuel tankers were burning 2 weeks ago, though you remember it was the intelligence directorate that set them on fire. Let me remind you of that video. It was quite a vivid one. So, in fact, this so-called Zaporizhzhia corridor, I mean the 100-kilometer zone, from the line of contact to the Azov coast is starting to come under very heavy, so to speak, fire from our drone systems. And right now, it's very encouraging that our soldiers are working on disrupting enemy logistics. Of course, I have to say right away that I might disappoint someone who thinks that these are actions that will have a long-term effect. No. Unfortunately, they will not have such a long-term effect because, unfortunately, it is basically impossible to destroy the railway completely. And although Russian Z military correspondents have started calling what is happening in our south a rail war that Ukraine has launched, unfortunately, we are not able to completely destroy their logistics. But we are doing everything possible to slow down enemy logistics so that the Russians are unable to deliver the most painful, the most concentrated massive strikes and do so simultaneously in different directions, whether in Donetsk, Sumy, Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia or Kherson. At the very least, if this strike is already inevitable, as we understand, the Russians have a considerable reserve of manpower that can and will be used during the summer campaign. If this strike is unavoidable, we need to soften it as much as possible and spread it out over time so that it's not a knockout, but rather a series of knockdowns from which we can get back up and continue the fight. This essentially is the logic that Ukraine is currently following by striking the enemy's railways in the occupied territories of the south. Why do I say that it's impossible to completely destroy the railway connections? Because, well, it's very simple. Any expert or specialist in this field will tell you whether you strike with missiles or drones, it doesn't matter. The railway tracks can be restored in a day, 2 or 3. You can simply lay the rails anew. Moreover, when it comes to logistics support, and especially railways, the Russians are very, very skilled at restoring them, often in just a matter of days. Besides that, let's even recall the history when the Russians themselves in 2022 and 2023 struck at our Ukrainian railway hubs trying to disable the railway in our rear on their own. They targeted traction stations and train stations, but all of it was in vain. The railway has continued to operate and still operates quite efficiently in the territory controlled by the Ukrainian government. The only option is to significantly slow down the logistics. At the same time, the strikes should not be targeted, but massive, delivering the most painful blows possible, trying to hit fuel tankers, because they burn for a long time, they burn intensely, and they burn brightly. It is very difficult to counteract such consequences. By the way, I want to point out that the Russians struck not only at traction stations, but, for example, remember how they tried to hit the Beskidi tunnel in the Carpathians, but that also brought them no logistical advantages or benefits. That's why we can't destroy their railway either, but we can, again, like the defense intelligence, strike at fuel tankers. We can carry out mass strikes on various locations and simultaneously disable railway infrastructure. This will buy us time. We can strike at the depots where, in fact, the Russian railway repair equipment is kept. And these depots are within the range of our missiles. Especially now, let's put it this way, we have the means to strike. So basically, the most we can squeeze out of such situations is to delay some deliveries or directly strike these shipments while they're in transit, as happened with the 13 tanks and 100 units of light armored vehicles. These are the events that the defense forces of the south of our country reported, literally this past weekend. This is the kind of scenario we're seeing now in the south. And by the way, this railway war isn't just happening in the south. It's also taking place on the territory of the Russian Federation. Right now, a lot of Russian railway facilities are being put out of commission. For example, here's a video from the day before yesterday. It's short, but it shows how in Saratov a freight locomotive was actually disabled and burned, and this really highlights an important point. We are looking for ways to fight the Russians asymmetrically, including on the territory of the Russian Federation, or more accurately, the subject of international law that is still called the Russian Federation, working with logistics. This backbone of the Russians, well, if we can't break it completely, because that would be very difficult, we can at least cause it some compression fractures. Ukrainian long-range artillery, rocket artillery, our missile forces, as well as deep strike drones, are capable of handling this. All of this can be done in a mode of destroying or damaging this backbone. For example, we can see how Ukrainian aviation in the Sumy region, specifically in the village of Volodymyrivka, is striking a bridge. This is also work against logistics destruction using the ASM Hammer, a guided bomb, a precise French bomb for destroying logistics so that the enemy, this huge horde of theirs, would have major problems with movement. By the way, there is news that equipment is being transferred here to the Sumy region from the southern direction. Again, we return to the statements made by the head of the Center for the Study of Occupation, Petro Andriushchenko, who posted this video on his Telegram channel showing footage of one of the largest equipment transfers in recent times. Elsewhere, according to preliminary information, this is supposedly equipment being redirected from Crimea and the Kherson region through Mariupol and Novazovsk towards Taganrog, from where it is sent by rail in the direction of Kursk and in reality to the Sumy region. In this convoy, more than 10 self-propelled artillery units, SPGs, air defense systems, and columns of about 40 trucks carrying ammunition and personnel have been recorded. That is, it is quite likely that the Russians are redeploying these forces to the north, as reported by our Ukrainian Center for the Study of Occupation, with the aim of strengthening their northern grouping. The question arises, what will this give the enemy? What will they be able to achieve? And why are they now transferring these resources there to the Kursk direction? It's all very simple, but at the same time, not so simple. It's very simple in the sense that the Russians have indeed started to slow down now in the Sumy region, slow down in terms of advances at some points. The Ukrainian Defense Forces have even begun to reclaim some tactical successes in the northern direction. And here, the entire so-called informational concept of the occupying Russian forces starts to fall apart. Because, well, they are selling the creation of a buffer zone in the Sumy region and similar things as a great victory. As of today, from what I know for certain, there are no enemy forces in Yunakivka, in Khotin Pisarivka, there are no enemy forces either. But of course, the enemy is present in other settlements that are marked in red on the deep state map. It's important to understand that just because an area is shaded red on the deep state map, it doesn't mean there is any heavy enemy equipment there. There are only infantry units here. As far as I know, the enemy does not have any artillery on Ukrainian territory. So the risks and threats that the residents of Sumy and the Sumy region fear, such as shelling by tube artillery or rocket artillery, these risks, well, they exist only if the shelling is carried out from the territory of the Russian Federation. Currently, there is no artillery observed on Ukrainian territory. Although earlier, the enemy did carry out significant attacks on these areas, including Khotin, using aviation. Here, in fact, the village was destroyed. Here is a video from the Ukrainian outlet Cordon Media, which covers the situation in the Sumy region very thoroughly and accurately. It shows exactly what is happening in Khotin. Here, according to journalists citing the head of the Khotin community, Mykola Toryanik, there are fewer than 50 people left in the entire community who, for various reasons, have not evacuated from the village. Although a mandatory evacuation has long since been announced in Khotin, it is in effect here. And in general, in the Sumy region, where mandatory evacuation is in place, people do indeed need to leave. Where mandatory evacuation has not been announced, well, that's up to people's choice. That means there isn't such an urgent need here. And that's the objective reality. The Russians are far from advancing deep into the Sumy region, and I hope they won't get through. Although, again, we can see that right now they are reinforcing this direction in order to maintain their momentum. But frankly speaking, this momentum is rather moderate. Although, of course, many different actors in this process perceive it as if the pace of occupation in the Sumy region is frantic. But that absolutely does not correspond to reality. Absolutely, friends, it does not correspond to reality. Let me explain why. Because, for example, those same settlements in the Sumy region, let's say, ones like Novenke or Basivka, Novenke and Basivka have been occupied by the enemy since February of this year. So, in fact, the occupation of these villages took place over, well, probably about 2 months, maybe even 3. This was all happening during that time, and it was a prolonged operation. The occupation of Loknya itself lasted about 1.5 to 2 months. It's not like what happened, on the deep state map, where it's marked and supposedly took place literally in just a few days. No one here lost Sumy region in a cascade over just a few days. As some Ukrainian members of parliament like Mariana Bizula are claiming, there is no cascading collapse of the front here. There is no simple breakdown of our defenses or anything like that. None of that is happening. What is happening is the enemy is being exhausted and territory is being traded for maximum losses among the Russian occupation force. That's what you can observe here in the Sumy region. If the direction intensifies, the pressure here in the Sumy region will also increase. But for now, it is exclusively about the border area. Moreover, our troops are trying to respond asymmetrically, not only by shooting down aircraft, as happened over the weekend, but also through the use of artillery, particularly rocket artillery. For example, here is a photo from the settlement of Rilsk. This is the Kursk region. Yesterday, Russians here complained that allegedly a cultural center building in Rilsk was hit by 4 HIMARS rockets. So just so you understand what kind of cultural center this is in reality, Russian occupation troops were actually based there. They had a permanent deployment point here, and yesterday, vital rockets from the HIMARS MLRS struck it actively, precisely, and effectively. There is work being done by air defense. There are airstrikes targeting logistics. There are saboteurs working to damage and disrupt railway logistics. And there is the work of rocket and artillery units to destroy enemy troops, let's say, even as they are still on their way. This is the maximum that our forces are squeezing out, the utmost capabilities that our troops and the defense forces are extracting from themselves. But it's important to understand that, well, there are certainly some moderate risks and threats. I'm not going to say here that everything is all rosy and perfect in the Sumy region. There are threats, there are risks, but it's not to the extent that we should be shouting that everything is catastrophic, everything has failed, and that everyone needs to evacuate from Sumy. If you follow that logic, that is dangerous, then you might as well evacuate from all of Ukraine. And I'm sure that many of you, dear viewers, do not support that concept. So thank you for your attention. Please leave comments and subscribe to us. All the best.